So the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, just said something I think is very strange. When addressing the European Parliament today, he remarked that Europe can't defend itself. And he outright dismissed the whole idea of Europe being able to defend itself without the help of the United States of America. He argued that for Europe to be able to defend itself, we would have to spend 10% of our GDP on defense, rather than the current goal, the NATO goal of 5%, which is just the goal. And no, I don't think any country in NATO has even reached the 5% goal yet. And he is claiming that to be able to make up for the loss of Washington's backing, for Europe to be able to defend itself without the help of the US, Europe would have to spend 10% of their GDP on defense. And he also said that we would have to build up our own nuclear capability, which would cost billions and billions of euros, and that in that case, you would lose the ultimate guarantor of our freedom, which is the US nuclear umbrella. So, hey, good luck. That was his statement. Now, this did garner a lot of criticism, mainly from France, which isn't surprising, considering that France is the main proponent of a more independent Europe. And the French foreign minister said that, "No, dear Mark Rutte, Europeans can and must take charge of their own security. Even the United States agrees. This is the European pillar of NATO." And that was the French foreign minister. And I do think he has a really good point here when saying that even the United States agrees. Because in Mark Rutte's statements, he was basically saying that, if we try to achieve this European independence, then we will lose the guarantees of the United States, which I don't see how that makes sense, because the United States themselves have argued that Europe should bolster its own defenses. For a long time, for many years, and now, especially under Trump, the US has said that, the United States has for too long, paid the cost for Europe's defense, and that now it's time for Europe to itself invest in Europe's defenses. And Trump has even, hinted that withdrawing some US troops from Europe, and I'm sure that the US would want a stronger Europe so that they are free to send more of their troops to, the Pacific against China in case of a Pacific war. So I agree. I mean, the United States would want a more independent Europe, I think. So that part of Rutte's argument, I don't think holds strong. And then also, the former ambassador to NATO, the former French ambassador to NATO, said that brandishing European weakness to secure the US guarantee is an outdated approach and sends the wrong message to Russia, which I also really agree with. Firstly, trying to show Europe as weak, is if that is the point, to secure more US backing, that's not going to work anymore, not with someone like Trump, who leads the United States. They already signaled that Europe needs to take more of their own responsibility for their own defenses, or that the US would otherwise, withdraw more from NATO. And it also does really send the wrong message to Russia. Russia doesn't care about international law. They don't care about, invading other countries. They only care about strength. And, the only defense Europe has is their own strength and the strength of our allies. And to then, brandish Europe as weak and not being able to defend itself. I don't understand why the leader of NATO, whose part of his responsibility is to show NATO as a strong alliance, to have deterrence. That's the whole point, to have deterrence against attacks. Why he would brandish Europe as weak, that doesn't really make any sense. And I've been trying to understand what's the thinking behind this statement by Mark Rutte. What is the point? And I can't really understand why. I mean, it could be to appease the US, as we've talked about, appeasing the US, showing that Europe is dependent on the US, that we need the United States' help. But as we've already talked about, the US itself has demanded that Europe should be able to defend itself. So that can't be the reason behind it. On the other hand, maybe it is to strengthen the European part of NATO, to show these weaknesses, to spur more investment into the European armed forces, to show, look how weak Europe is, we need to rearm. But that can't be it either, because Europe is already rearming, and the tone of his argument isn't we are weak, we should rearm. He's saying that we can't defend ourselves, we need the United States. It's basically hopeless to even try being able to defend ourselves independently. So it can't be, and if it's not one of these two reasons, then what is the reason? Is it just to say, no, we can't, let's just give up? If that's the case, even if that's true, if he thinks that there's no way to Europe to defend itself, why would he say that out loud? What's the point of that? What kind of a message is he sending? And that's what I don't understand. What is his reasoning behind having this argument publicly? Displaying both, European, European division, European weakness. I don't know why. I can understand that it's a tough job, having to deal with Trump, having to, keep the alliance together, trying to balance the European part of NATO with the North American part, with the United States. It's a tough job, and I think he's done a decent job so far. But these statements, I really don't understand what's the point of them. But if you have any thought of your own, feel free to comment.